Happy Friday, folks. Hope you're doing well. We will not be chasing the news cycle this morning. However, we'll save that for our Feel Good Friday segment this afternoon. However, Brian Lilley dropped an amazing article really reminding people of the politics around our oil sands, around our resource development here in this country, and why it's always been so contentious, and the history of, our southern neighbors who love to get involved in our resource extraction, don't they? And we'll be discussing that, and, just a quick reminder of, who really has the last say on these issues. Welcome to the Elevate Podcast. I'm your host, Josh. If you're getting value from today's episode, take the time to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us to grow. It helps us get new audiences. And it helps people see that there is something different than what the mainstream media has to offer. And now let's get our first story, shall we? So as I said, Brian Lilley dropped this, which was a very fascinating article, I have to admit. Coastal First Nations is an activist group. They have no pipeline veto. And so this is one thing I'll ask you is, whenever I hear David Eby or Mark Carney or really any Liberal or NDP member talk about Coastal First Nations, you really think about them as what? A coalition. You think about them as a monolith in some ways of, all right, whatever they say is what everyone feels, right? And Brian Lilley tries to reframe this conversation, reminding people like, Coastal First Nations, let's have a quick reminder of who they are. We're not actually talking about directly the nations themselves and what they have to say. We're talking about an activist group that runs a nonprofit that claims to represent the coalition of First Nations communities. It's very fascinating. Let's read into it. The offices of Coastal First Nations, which is officially known as the Great Bear Initiative Society, are found at the corner of Granville and West Hastings in Vancouver. This is an organization that attempts to speak as though they represent all Indigenous voices on the British Columbia coast when they clearly do not. The Great Bear Initiative Society, now known as CFN, Coastal First Nations, is a political advocacy group that was set up with millions of dollars from left-wing American foundations opposed to oil and gas development in Canada. These organizations, such as the Tides Foundation, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies, have donated millions to stop oil and gas production, and that includes here in Canada. In 2008, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, one of the early donors to the Coastal First Nations, organized a campaign against Canada's tar sands to try and shut down oil production in northern Alberta. They were key to organizing against the Northern Gateway Pipeline project, which also proposed to build an oil pipeline in Kitimat, BC, just as Alberta Premier Daniel Smith wants to do today. What we're seeing now is simply a continuation of the opposition that was funded by the American sources in the early days and now is too often funded by the Canadian federal government. Back in 2014, when Northern Gateway was still a going concern, Art Starrett, then BMW driving executive director for the Coastal First Nations, threatened the project with Indigenous resistance, even though most communities along the route supported Northern Gateway. Anybody tries sticking shovels in the ground, there will be First Nations there to stop them, Starrett told APTN at the time. Now, Coastal First Nations, the not-for-profit based in Vancouver and set up with left-wing anti-oil foundation money from the United States, is once again saying there will be no pipeline built on their watch. We are here to remind the Alberta government, the federal government, and any potential private proponent that we will never allow oil tankers on our coast and that this pipeline project will never happen, the group said in a statement last week. This is kind of a reminder of how we allow the minority of voices to have the loudest say on these issues. This goes back, as Brian Lilley says, a long time. The American groups that he's mentioned have been funding this for a very long time as well. They have donated to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars to Canadian nonprofits to stop oil resource development in our country. And they lobbied Obama very hard, and that's why Obama nixed the Keystone XL pipeline. That's why that was the first thing Biden did in 2020 when he got into office, was nix the Keystone XL pipeline. It was always an utter to choke out Canadian resource development. And for a long time, these groups had a lot to say. A lot of times people were listening to these groups. But now that we are starting to realize that we can't actually rely on everybody else for help, we actually got to start doing things on our own. Oh, shoot, we actually need to start our resource development here in this country. Oh, shoot. Donald Trump has given us a reason to start looking inside ourselves and figuring out what we need to do in our country. However, this is the history of these huge American organizations funding our nonprofits here in Canada to stop resource development here. It's insane. You had Vivian Krause write about this back in 2012 for the Financial Post. Oil sands money trail. Last week, on the eve of the environmental review for the $5.5 billion Northern Gateway pipeline project that would carry Alberta oil to Kitimat for export to Asia, Canada's Minister for Natural Resources, Joe Oliver, expressed concern that foreign-funded environmentalists would jeopardize the review and block the pipeline. Oliver didn't mention my name, but the research that raised concerns about the foreign funding of environmentalism in Canada is apparently mine. For 5 years, on my own nickel, I've been following the money and the science behind environmental campaigns, and I've been doing what the CRA hasn't been doing. I've gathered information about the origin and the stated purpose of grants from U.S. foundations to green groups in Canada. My research is based on U.S. tax returns because the U.S. Internal Revenue Service requires greater disclosure from nonprofits than does the CRA. By my analysis and calculations, since 2000, U.S. foundations have granted at least $300 million US to various environmental organizations and campaigns in Canada, especially in BC. The San Francisco-based Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation alone has granted $92 million US. Gordon Moore is one of the co-founders of Intel Corp, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and the David and Lucille Packard Foundation have granted a combined total of $90 million US, mostly to BC groups. These foundations were created by the founders of Hewlett Packard Co., the Philadelphia-based Pew Charitable Trust, created by the founders of Sun Oil, has granted at least $82 million over the past decade, and at least $40 million has been granted by the other U.S. foundations. Of the $300 million that I've traced, at least $150 million US was specifically for the Great Bear Rainforest Initiative, the Pacific Northcoast Integrated Management Area, and the Boreal Forest Initiative. All money focused and dedicated to BC to make sure nothing goes through that province and gets to Tidewater. So you want to know why things have not been going well, why we haven't been able to get things started and resources developed in our country for so long. And you know the talking point that happens in House of Commons? Well, at least the Liberals provided a pipeline, they're referring to TMX, that they nixed and then realized they had to revive, and they spent 3 times the amount of dollars and used public dollars to purchase it. Remember that? Well, they love to take credit. Well, only under a Liberal government did a pipeline get made or built. Never happened under a Conservative government. I wonder why. However, I will say, yes, there definitely needs to be ownership placed upon the Conservative governments at the time to show a little bit more oomph, a little bit more intestinal fortitude to fight against these environmental groups. However, I understand times have changed. Times are different. There might be a little bit more political will these days than there was back then. However, we've seen American, and we know, and I know we've known this for a long time, but it's good to put names and dollar figures to these people. And to remind you here in 2025, what we've been talking about for the past 15 years and longer, of how these environmental groups in these states fund our nonprofits here to cause chaos for our resource development. And you wonder why Alberta's upset these days, because they've been seeing this go on for far too long. Nothing's been done about it, and has led to Canada not being as prosperous. But hey, the US, no problem, will fund and work with the Saudis all day. But the minute Canada wants to extract their resources, oh, that's dirty oil now. That's bad. No, we don't want any of that. I'll be honest, the only elbows up I really care about is getting American influence out of our politics. I'll be straight up about that. And I know it's going to be near impossible to a degree, but I'd like to limit it to a point at least. We see what the US does. We've seen it for decades at this point. Regime change wars, going into these countries for their oil. Well, we're seeing that with Venezuela right now, aren't we? They can never do that to Canada, however, because, well, they're our neighbor. They're our biggest trading partner. They live right next to us, so we can't do a regime change war in Canada. However, we might just have some of our most wealthy organizations funding their nonprofits to make sure that they cannot develop their resources, because then we can buy it off them for pennies on the dollar. But don't get it twisted. I'm not going to pretend and sit here and say this was the only motivation by Barack Obama at the time. I do think this was the motivation by the Bush administration. However, Obama got infected with the same thing Justin Trudeau was infected with too, which is we need to end everything. So that's why he nixed the Keystone XL pipeline, because of these environmental groups saying oil's done, we're moving to green new energy. That was Obama's idea. Joe Biden followed that as well. However, the more Republican governments over time, that was definitely their motivation, is if we can limit where Canada sells their oil, we can keep it all for ourselves. And that's typically been the behavior and motivation of American administrations in the past. With the Trump administration, I can't really say where their focus lies at this point. However, all I know is we need to take the scare that we've received from the U.S. at this point in time and use that to be able to start building those pipelines and building and getting resource development happening in this country once again. We need to capitalize on that. We just have to. And that's the thing, is these American organizations have done a good job of like funding these nonprofits and causing chaos here in Canada. And then, as Brian Lilly said in his article, then we had our Canadian government who joined in on the fun too with the Liberal government over the past 10 years. You have Trudeau come in, start just kiboshing and cutting Alberta out at the knees. And then you have the likes of Guilbeault helping him do that at the same time. And so that's why everyone's kind of losing their minds in the Liberal caucus these days, because this wasn't the plan. We're done with oil. We're moving to the green new future, right? Well, who knows at this point? As I said, half measures Carney is just trying to please everybody while trying to buy himself time, and doesn't seem to be working out too much. And so this is why I have a huge problem with the likes of people all of a sudden getting really upset at Donald Trump because he said it to your face. And then you realize, oh shoot, what's happening? I don't like that guy now. No. This has been happening over many administrations in the United States, over many years. And this is partially the reason why, at least as a Canadian perspective, I really hate Obama. And can't totally fault him for it, because we saw this letter sent to him days before his inauguration in 2009 from David Suzuki Foundation, from the Environmental Defense Canada, Forest Ethics, Greenpeace Canada, Natural Resources Defense Council, Pembina Institute, Sierra Club of Canada. You know, all the Canadian institutions that accepted all this American money. Yeah, these guys penned a letter to Obama on January 13th, 2009, asking that he do not revive talks or continue any type of resource development between Canada and the United States. And the pressure worked. And this all came out in the Alberta inquiry back in 2021, where all this information came to the surface of the money that went over to these groups who are having direct impact and influence on the policies in the U.S. and leading essentially Obama to make the decisions he's done, including nixing the Keystone XL pipeline. And then on top of that, the continued funding that happened to our environmental groups here that kept us from putting a pipeline to the West Coast. So this is the issue I have, right? This is where we stand. And what I do want to remind us of is back to this group has been funded historically by deep American pockets, right? And the other issue I have, and this is one thing that Brian Lilly hit at the end of his article, is that this group doesn't speak for everybody. It says, while they call themselves the rights and title holders to the area, that's not accurate. They are a not-for-profit that has some representation in coastal communities, but they don't speak for everyone now any more than they did in 2014 when CFN opposed Northern Gateway, while most communities along the route supported it. People like Ellis Ross, the current Conservative MP for Skeena Bulky Valley and former chief of the Haisla Nation in Kitimat, a potential export port for an oil pipeline, has long been in favor of a pipeline. He's not alone on this, but most media would have you believe that Coastal First Nations is a group representing all First Nations on the BC coast. Time and again, the many First Nations communities who support resource development projects are ignored. Those who will claim that they oppose these projects will be given far more airtime, far more column inches in newspapers, and far more attention than those who want to move forward economically. The memorandum of understanding between the federal government and Alberta doesn't guarantee a pipeline. It puts forward the path for this to happen. Some want to act as if the Indigenous groups have a veto, or that the British Columbia government has a veto, when the law and the Supreme Court have made it clear that neither do. We need a serious discussion about how or if a pipeline can be built to the Northwest Coast. Treating some groups as if they are bigger and more important than they are, or as if they hold special powers, doesn't serve anyone. Coastal First Nations is an activist group. That is all. Treat them as such. Boom. This is the issue I have, is you have these white liberals who love to claim they're not racist, but they then treat the First Nations as if they're a monolith, treat the First Nations as if they're one voice, and they don't treat them as if they are a diverse group of people. So you have one group that speaks up on behalf of everybody here. We are going to deny this. We're going to be in its way. Boom, boom, boom. However, there's multiple First Nations groups, multiple bands. There's like, no, please, we would love to be cut in on this deal and get some royalties, get some money from this project. If it's going to go through our territory, we'd love to work with you because we'd like to fund ourselves from outside revenue that isn't the government. Because quite frankly, we kind of hate the government. If I'm being honest, if we can find exterior sources to fund our communities, then we'll do that. Which I think as Canadians and everybody across the board can agree on. We want to be self-sufficient and have the right to self-determination, don't we? And this is something that really caught my eye, is it takes government officials, specifically those who are conservative, to have some gall, to actually live on conservative principles and values. And this is something Danielle Smith reminded us all of on Jasmine Lane's podcast a couple of weeks ago. This is one of her closing statements at the end of that show.
And the biggest frustration that I hear is when people elect a conservative government and they're so cautious and so timid that they move things along incrementally and then they never get their agenda implemented, and that alienates their supporter base, and then they lose the next election. So we're going to be a conservative government. We know that things went a little bit too far with woke progressivism on so many fronts, and we're trying to get things back to the center, trying to get them back to the middle. And I think we've succeeded in a lot of ways. I think we've changed.
And she goes on to talk about the different things that they've done and succeeded in as a government. And she makes a great point, is conservative governments need to be just that, be conservative. They need to stop allowing liberal parties and environmentalist groups or far left groups to dictate how they're going to govern. Too many times conservatives say, we're going to do this, and then they get in and they get freaked out. They get afraid. They get nervous. Why do you think Danielle Smith has been so successful? She has found a way to thread the needle of conservative values linked with compassion so that it can be communicated properly. You're always going to have the people who are going to vilify her. That's always how they're always going to be there. However, Danielle Smith has done a good job of winning the argument and winning people over to her side who are in the middle. And that is one thing that even the groups like the PPCs of the world just don't seem to understand just yet. They are bull in china shops. And unfortunately, you're never going to win any influence. You're never going to win over anybody doing that because they see you as crazy. It's oil and water. Our mentalities and the way our attitudes work in this country didn't happen overnight. It happened over decades. And unfortunately, you can't just come in guns a-blazing. You have to come in thoughtfully, but as well was with strength and with conviction, and to continue to move the dial back slowly. There's some things you have to move quickly on, and others it will take time. And I think Danielle Smith has done a good job of threading that needle of, all right, I think the issue, the trans issue in Alberta, I think she did fantastic with. She did a good job of approaching that with compassion and understanding, while at the same time saying, this is not appropriate and this is not happening. We are going to protect our youth. And if you don't like that, too bad. It was a perfect balance. And that is something I think all conservatives can learn from Danielle Smith. Learn how to be bold, courageous, but as well alienate the fewest amount of people as possible in the process. But anyways, I'll leave it there. I'll see you this afternoon. Have yourselves a good one. I'm out.